Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by Loughborough University. This podcast seeks to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in sport, then this is the podcast for you. Today, I'm with Dr. Richard Blagrove and Dr. Max Paquette, and we're here to discuss injury and runners. We discuss the main reasons why elite runners get injured. We take a look at a variety of factors, including training load, the biomechanics of running technique, and strength training, before providing some recommendations for coaches and athletes.
Thanks, Max, for joining us this afternoon. I think it's morning where you are at the moment, Max. We're talking about distance runners and injuries as part of this podcast, and we know that distance running as a sport has got quite a high incidence of overuse type injuries, even compared to all the other endurance sports. And obviously for a runner who picks up an injury, it can be their worst nightmare because it derails their training plans and they potentially lose a lot of the gains that they've made in fitness over the previous months and even years. And particularly for elite runners, they're obviously treading this fine line between potentially being one of the best in the world at their event and also on the sidelines with an injury. So for practitioners that work with elite level runners like myself and Max, we're always trying to find this balance between enough volume to actually get an improvement in fitness, but also still remain injury free, and also trying to explore different interventions and strategies that might also reduce the risk of an elite endurance runner getting injured. So just to kick off, Max, what would you say are the main reasons why runners tend to get injured or pick up overuse type injuries?
I think, Rich, in this case, are you referring more to the elite runners or any runner?
Yeah, more the elite runners, particularly the ones that are preparing for like the Tokyo Olympics, for example.
Yeah, I think, and there's some research on this, but I think elite runners are very, very specific individuals. And this is elite athletes in general, right? Their approach to training is very, very intense, one. And they tend to be pretty sort of type A personalities where they want to make sure that, no stone is left unturned. And so they try to do absolutely everything that they know will make them better. And although that's a good thing, often it's not, right? Because they're thinking, I'm having this fantastic workout. I'm having this fantastic training cycle, and I could probably push a little more just because I know what it takes to be the best. And because of my personality, I need to do a little more to convince myself that I've done everything. And as a result, sometimes pushing a little too hard is the mistake. You mentioned hovering around up and over or up and under the injury threshold line, arbitrarily speaking. And so that's exactly what I think it comes down to is even though they know that if they just hover below whatever the injury threshold is, they're going to be just fine because they'll be consistent. But they know, I can do that last interval, or I can do that extra run, or, those types of things. So I think that's more so, I wouldn't pinpoint a risk factor. I think it's more of an attitude more than anything else. Yeah,
definitely. And I'd certainly agree with that from my experiences of working with runners. And you kind of hear all these anecdotes that elite runners come out with about, I was thinking about my main competitor or the guys that I'm going to be racing in the final at the Olympic Games and what training they'd be doing today. And I just needed to do an extra rep or an extra run or an extra set in the gym, whatever it might be, because it would just give me that little edge. And whether that's true or not, it's debatable.
I think it's sort of this idea of like go big or go home, or, like while you're sleeping, your opponent's training, that mindset has always been at the forefront. And perhaps it's evolving a little bit and changing. But in general, I would say that most people think this way. It's like more is always better, right? And so it's quite fascinating to me as a biomechanist who studies movement and risks to actual musculoskeletal tissue. I always find it interesting that in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking about behavior and psychology and what dictates the decision making. And we tend to not really think about that much in a musculoskeletal standpoint.
Yeah, sure. And you kind of touched upon it with the answer you provided before, but I guess any kind of overuse injury is really, really complex, or the reasons why a runner gets an overuse injury are complex in nature. They're going to be quite multifactorial. So certainly as scientists, like you as a biomechanist, me as a physiologist, we're kind of always looking for just that single reason or what the commonality is across a lot of different runners, why a runner gets injured. But usually you're not going to find what the commonality is. It's going to be slightly different for each person. But you mentioned before about elite runners always wanting to do that little bit more, push that little bit harder to try and just get the edge on their competitors. But how do you think that runners can try and prevent, I guess, doing that too often or causing like a kind of training error and bringing about an overuse type injury?
Yeah, I think based on my experience being around at least North American coaches and athletes, I think it comes down to trusting your support crew, your support staff, your coaches, your physios and strength coaches, and knowing that if they're clearly able to express the importance of backing off and make it clear that backing off sometimes is actually moving forward, I think that's where it starts from, right? You as a coach, and I'm sure you've felt the same way, Rich, it's like sometimes it goes both ways, right? An athlete can say, "Oh, I'm going to keep pushing," and a coach can also be the same way. Where you might be thinking, "Oh, they look great today. Like I think they can really get that last interval in," or maybe we tack on something at the end, or we do a little more. But I think staying true to what the plan is and convincing athletes that one, you're confident in that plan and that they trust you. And I think that plays a major role. And on the physio side, on the clinical side, a lot of athletes now are seeing physios and chiros and strength and conditioning professionals to help reduce injury risks. We don't necessarily have a good handle on how to prevent injuries, and we're not too sure about the strength part of it. But it certainly helps if there's confidence in the group. We're like, hey, we're doing this for this reason. Even if it's not that clear, to me, it doesn't matter. To me, it's like the athlete knowing that this is a thing that my support crew believes in. And if I buy in, this should help me, be confident in my training and hopefully reduce risk of injury. So that's what I would kind of say. It's not so much what should you not do, but, it's a trust process. It's a team process and everything sort of is aligned.
Yeah. And I'd 100% agree with that, even from a strength and conditioning perspective, that it's really, I guess, just about knowing your athlete well and having trust in the relationship. Mm-hmm. That if you're going to prescribe a certain amount, volume, intensity of training, that they're going to execute that and do it. And if you tell them to back off because of, I don't know, lifestyle stresses that are going on, or if they've had a bad night's sleep, or they've broken up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or they've got media stresses going on in their life, like all of these sorts of things that are outside of their normal training, that you tell them to back off a little bit in the weights room or with their running training, and they're able to do that, and it helps kind of manage the sort of total overall stress that's going on in their life.
Yeah, and I think some coaches it's a fine line for coaches, right? If there's coaches, if there are coaches listening, or even support staff, you can't push the boundaries of, hey, talk to me, what's going on? Like, why, there has to be a level of trust and understanding where the athlete might not say anything to the coach, but they might in an indirect way. Hey, stuff's going on in my life. I'm having a rough go at the moment. I want to train hard, and they might not say they want to stop an interval session or a training cycle, but the coach, hopefully is able to see that there's a need to pull the plug, if you will, on a session and understand that it doesn't really matter why. It's just that things aren't going well. Yeah. And I think that's all part of the monitoring approaches that, sports scientists and coaches have to implement.
Yeah, sure. So it seems like we're in agreement about, I guess, the most important thing, like just trust, communication, like knowing your athletes well, and then kind of auto-regulating training almost on a day-to-day, session-to-session basis. Mm-hmm. But I guess a little bit more scientifically, are there any other strategies that either you've used or you're aware of from the scientific literature that are quite valid in terms of monitoring a runner's fatigue and their state of readiness when they're approaching key sessions? And are those kind of sensitive enough to try and detect where they might be more susceptible to an injury?
I think that's like what we're all looking for, right? We're all looking for a way to monitor this and hopefully identify injuries. I'll start with the injury part. The short answer is no. There's nothing really that we know about, and you're well versed in this area as well, and you know that. Unfortunately, we're not at a point where we could say this method will help you identify or detect periods of higher injury risk. So, lots of very cool and fascinating work going on in this field or in this area. But I think in terms of monitoring athlete readiness or fatigue, I mean, borrowing from sports, cycling and team sports from all the way back to the late 70s and early 80s, I think nothing has changed much. I think it goes back to behavior. There's a lot of, ways to monitor training load or training stress, whether it's using duration and some measure of internal loading or heart rate or RPE or rate of perceived exertion or effort. But ultimately, and I don't know how many conversations I've had lately about this topic specifically, but many. And I think people ask, what's the best tool? And I say, sometimes the best tool is a tool that you've never heard of and you're using within your athletes or your team in a very consistent and reliable way. As a scientist like yourself, I want to see validity and I want to see reliability assessments, and that's normal in science. In the field, we might deal with a coach who just says, this athlete's not ready. And I might say, what do you mean? Oh, I can feel it. Or I noticed the way they hold their head. I noticed the way they walk. I noticed the way that they're doing these drills, right? And it's not even necessarily interval splits. It might be like, oh, they're going slow today. They're tired, obviously, right? If the performance goes down, that's the biggest detection of fatigue, right? But you can sometimes detect that before it even happened, which is kind of what you want, right? Just you do your warm up, you do some drills, you look a little bit off, whatever that might be. Just go do an easy run today, or just do a few light strides or something like that. That's the kind of monitoring that needs to happen, not necessarily post-session or post-training cycle, because the tools aren't able to do this in real time like a coach can, right? The tools can help us say after a session or a cycle, oh, that was way too big, that was way too much, whatever that might be. So then the next cycle, the next session, we can back off. But the best tool is the coach on the day, on minute by minute assessments. I'm sure you've seen this in the weight room as well, right? Like you're working.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the movements change, the techniques change. So
Yeah, no, that's already interesting. And like you mentioned at the start, there's a lot of companies, a lot of groups around the world that kind of promote all these various different physiological tools for trying to monitor fatigue and readiness, like heart rate variability, sleep monitoring apps, and so on, like all the different kind of wellness questionnaires. And then the more kind of, I guess, sophisticated, like blood hormonal and immune system markers that you've got as well, that some elite athletes will have access to. And in a strength and conditioning setting, you see quite a few coaches using various different neuromuscular function tools, like simple hand grip, like jump, and like even kind of calf strength on a day-to-day basis. But I don't think a lot of those are kind of sensitive enough to necessarily pick up when an athlete's reaching a state of kind of non-functional overreaching, and they're edging towards overtraining. And so therefore they're obviously going to be at a higher susceptibility of illness and injury and so on. So I think the overriding message really is like work closely with the coach, know your athletes well, and use some of these kind of tools, I guess, to inform decisions, but certainly not dictate or kind of guide them too much.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in this day and age, there's a lot of online coaching or consulting. And I think that's where the tools come in handy, like heart rate, for example, or RPE, or as long as it's done consistently and reliably. I do think, though, that, again, as a scientist, I still think that nothing will ever beat the one-on-one, minute by minute assessment of what's going on by a human being about another human being. And it's not to say that you can identify injuries, but you can certainly identify periods that are a bit off. And whether or not that leads to an injury is up for debate, but it doesn't really matter, right? It is the point is. And on the topic of wearables, I think, for those that are listening, I would say lately, or the last maybe 2 or 3 years, I think despite Twitter having its bad moments, it has some fantastic moments at times as well. Yeah. And there's been such great discussions about wearable technology and downfalls or pitfalls and value in it. And just recently, one of my good friends up in Canada, Trent Stellingworth, tweeted something about, we're seeing all these tech companies coming out with wearable devices and platforms and all this and that, and it's great. But then he said, but if I read something like this is life changing or revolutionary or something like that, I'm out. Right?
It's just marketing, isn't it?
It's just that it's at this point, the technology has the speed at which technology is developed has surpassed the science.
Mm.
And so we're now at a point where marketing drives these tech platforms and instruments. And so statements like that are big red flags. And it's so easy for someone who doesn't necessarily has had the chance to, or hasn't had the chance to be studying sports sciences and limitations or advantages of wearable technology. They don't necessarily have the ability to discern between, pseudoscience and beautiful marketing versus science. So I'm on a couple of social media groups that are like coaching related in the US, and I swear if you if you logged on there and looked at some of the statements and opinions and thoughts, you would think, what is this, 1942? It's just it's really backwards, and there's a lot of people, and I think I won't get into that anyway, but there's a lot of US related things there anyway.
Just changing direction very slightly. So what we've spoken about so far is largely around trying to reduce injury risk and types of things that runners might want to think about doing just to kind of monitor fatigue, readiness, and the risk of getting injured. But if you've got a runner who is injured, or they've had a succession of niggles or succession of the same type of overuse injury, from a biomechanical perspective, is there anything that you would always do with a runner, like in a sort of clinical setting, like things that you would evaluate or look at to try and unpick what things might be contributing towards those injuries?
Yeah. I tend to use a pretty, I will say, set but also malleable or adaptable process, or steps. And the first thing is, an athlete says, hey, I have pain, because that's always, it's not like, hey, my tendon is inflamed, right? It's always symptoms.
Yeah.
So I have pain in my leg, and then you start to, you can, although I'm not a clinician, because of my sort of background in biomechanics, anatomy, and physiology, I can narrow it down pretty quickly, as most of us can. So, hey, I have pain here. Okay, where exactly? And like, oh, right here. Okay, does it hurt when you press on it? Right? Is it localized pain? Is it more broad? Is it diffuse? Or is it when you dorsiflex your ankle or move your toes up, or when you plantar flex your ankle, move your toes down? Do you feel anything? Trying to potentially rule out, is it, bone or tendon or something, because of movement. And then, when does it start? It starts at the beginning of the run and it goes away. Okay, well, that's a good sign for potentially tendinopathy, right? Mm. Or I don't feel at the start, but then it gets worse towards the run. Oh, that's potentially BSI or bone stress injury.
Yeah.
But all this happens in my brain, right? And this might happen within a few minutes of talking to the athlete. But then the next step is always, and I'm very lucky to have this resource. I have a really good friend here who's Australian, and he lives here in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's a physio at one of our clinics here, and he's a runner, and he just completely gets it. He's on top of it. He'll probably listen to this podcast, and he knows Tom Goom and everyone else that does running physio, Rich Willie, and them. So he's just a good resource. So my process is figure out what's going on. Make sure that you're not doing anything stupid at a training session, right? Sometimes it's muscular. Okay, well, it should be okay. Like you might be able to finish up like this little part of it, right? Or you could cross train or something like that. But then if I suspected something more serious, like a bone stress injury or something like that, or a tendinopathy, tendinopathies are kind of low risk in a sense. That it's not going to tear necessarily, and it's uncomfortable, but you can deal with it. But then you see a physio to help out. that's my process anyway. And then I would encourage coaches, and this is not common, but find time in your city, wherever you are, not to interview or screen physios, but try to become friends with some physios and understand how they think, what their resources, what they use, what's their approach. And once you find someone who you really feel is good, then develop a good relationship with them. And then just make sure they're in your circle and you can work with them on a regular basis. I think that's the best advice. We can't overstep and provide clinical advice or rehabilitation. And then once that's done, then I'll work with Mark to sort of graduate the athlete back to full training, right? So they'll have some rehab exercises. We'll start transitioning from rehab exercises back to strength training, and then we'll also do some, progression, whether it's lower gravity running or cross training or shorter sessions or on different surfaces. These types of things will all come into play.
Yeah, sure. And just going back to what you were saying about social media again, and not to certainly criticize anybody that engages with discussion in social media groups, but what you see a lot, particularly in Facebook running groups and sometimes on Twitter, is that as soon as a runner gets injured, even at an elite level, the first thing that they blame, or maybe a practitioner blames, is their running technique. They kind of look at it and sort of say, "Oh, you need to get a better technique," but they don't necessarily define what a good technique versus a bad technique is. But all runners that are injured must have a bad technique, so therefore there's something about their running gait that needs to be altered. What does kind of the research sort of suggest around that from a kind of biomechanical perspective?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this point up. I think I talked with my wife about this a lot. I don't know why, but I really struggle with letting things go when it comes to biomechanics and injuries and form. And when I see someone on Facebook posting like, "Oh, hey, I have a kid who's got shin pain," and then people come on and say, "Oh, they need to do this X, Y, Z," and I'm thinking, "Oh boy," I'm like, don't engage. Yeah. And inevitably, well, not inevitably, sometimes I won't, but at times I will. And then you realize like, okay, this is a lost cause, right?
Yeah.
And I think from the research standpoint, well, we know, and a lot of folks in the UK, including Izzy Moore, Dr. Izzy Moore, has done some great work on gait retraining and not necessarily just in runners, but and Rich Willey and the folks that he's worked with here in the U.S. and a number of other people have done some gait retraining work, not necessarily only in injured athletes, but in just athletes in general, to see how a specific type of gait retraining modality might alter loading on specific regions of the body. Loading being forces or things like that, right? And I think, it certainly depends on the location of symptoms or potential tissue injury. But there are things that, let me step back, Rich. The research isn't too clear on how this can help, right? We're very confident that we have certain modalities like increasing step rate or cadence or number of steps per minute, which means that if the speed is constant, if the speed doesn't change or the pace doesn't change, if you take more steps per minute, your steps shorten. Right? That's how you achieve this. And we know that if we do that, we can reduce loading of a lot of various areas of the body, like the Achilles and the knee as well, and all sorts of things like that, which is very interesting scientifically, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this will help an injury per se, right? But I will say that based on that research, a lot of physios, and I think that's the right approach, is as they return someone back from a bone stress injury, like a tibial stress injury, for example, they will cue things like higher cadence or more steps per minute so that they can shorten the steps and potentially reduce the forces on the tibia. Yeah. Just to help speed up healing a little bit as they come, or not speed up healing, but help prevent more damage while they're coming back. So aside from the other topic, as you've, kind of seen as well, is like the foot strike pattern, or how your foot is angled when you hit the ground. That is a bit of a we could open a whole Pandora's box about the foot strike pattern, but it depends on the situation, and I'm always a kind of in the middle kind of person. I think there may be value sometimes, but I've never seen anyone successfully changed strike pattern, who wasn't injured, and really saw like important change, whatever that might be, right? Lower risks of injury, because you can't tell. Like, if you weren't injured and you change your strike pattern and don't get injured, why would you say that that's because of the strike pattern? Like, you weren't injured before. So there's a lot of those kind of weird nuances that are hard to tease out scientifically, of course.
We could probably do an entire podcast just on this question around running technique and what's more efficient and economical and what potentially might lower the risk of injury.
And again, I think just want to mention to the listeners, Dr. Izzy Moore, who's on Twitter, she's at Cardiff Met, I believe, still. And she's done some cool work on this and always has good information to share on that topic.
Yeah, and I'll plug my the book that I edited, but she contributed a chapter to a book I recently edited on the science and practice of distance running. And the main message that she put across in that book chapter was that there is no kind of like optimal or kind of perfect running technique. And if a runner is getting a succession of different injuries, then changing technique might be one option, but it's quite individual. And as you were kind of alluding to with your response there, if you change an aspect of a runner's technique, it might do nothing at all to change their risk of getting that injury again or another injury. Whereas for other runners, it could be completely career changing in terms of their running career. It could massively reduce things like loading rates and load on specific tissues that are quite vulnerable to injury. So therefore it's definitely worth doing. Right. And so she kind of takes us on a bit of a journey with Tom Goom and Kelly Ashford in that chapter to kind of explore what sorts of contexts and scenarios that you might look to change a runner's technique. And you mentioned some of them there. So like very, very aggressive heel striking type actions where the foot's a long way in front of the body. So not necessarily heel striking per se, but the position of the foot sort of relative to the hips and the center of mass. Things like the knee kind of dropping in excessively and the kind of drop that you see around the pelvis with some female runners in particular. And a couple of other sort of typical aspects of gait that are associated with certain types of injury. And in those scenarios, you probably would look to do some sort of gait retraining, and then how you would do it, she goes into a little bit as well.
Yeah, just three little things on this, Rich. So I will say I have used gait retraining in uninjured runners before, but mostly with regards to sprinting or speed. And so a lot of distance runners, at least these days, aren't really taught how to run or how to sprint, I should say.
Yeah. And
sprinting is a little more straightforward. Like you don't see much variation, at least, let me rephrase, I don't want to offend any sprint coaches or folks out there, but you don't see much variation with the naked eye, at least if you're not an expert sprint coach, right? It's a pretty straight, it's a very complex motion, but one of the main goals is to produce a lot of vertical force. And so you're from the ground, right? So when you're running, you're basically wanting to really collide the foot with the ground as vertically as possible when you're sprinting. And that makes it a bit simpler. And sometimes you see a distance runner who will not change how they run at all when they decide to sprint. And as a result, they can't really sprint as fast as they can. So I have a junior athlete who is a pretty heavy heel striker and no injuries, never been injured. He's in grade 12 or about to go to university. And I try to cue him to shorten his steps a little bit when he accelerates to sprint, right? And then what happened was fascinating is that he could do that, but then he was still striking the ground the same exact way, where often when that happens, you see people striking the ground more with their midfoot potentially, just kind of how sprinters attack the ground. I still think that sprinters collide with the ground with their forefeet and then the foot falls flat. But a lot of sprint coaches say that that's not the case, but maybe that's just a verbiage difference here. But so it is definitely possible. I had a good conversation with Dayton Ritzenhein, American 3-time Olympian, competed just in 2, but just because of injury. But he was coached by now famous or infamous coach Alberto Salazar, and when he moved to the group, Alberto wanted to change Dayton's form, not because of injury, because he thought he should look more like Kenenisa Bekele.
Right.
And so he did that. And then that was basically the start of the end for Dayton's career.
Right.
where he just went into a circle of just nonstop injuries from there on out. So an example of, gait retraining going wrong for the wrong, because the intention was for the wrong reason. And the third thing, Rich, was about the book. I bought the book, of course, and I've got it right here in our living room.
Thanks.
It just arrived a few days ago, and I think it's just really, really great. I've skimmed through all the chapters for now, and then I'll sit down when I have more time and really get a good full read of it. But I told my wife, Lauren, last week, and I said, because if you recall, you had emailed me, you had invited me for the biomechanical part of it, and I told my wife, I've said no to a lot of things in my career, and this is the one thing I regret saying no to. At the time, I was very busy and a little overwhelmed, and even though I really wanted to do it, I had to say no. But then now that it's done, of course, and I haven't done any work on it, and it looks great, I'm like, I wish I had done it.
Oh, no, thanks. I do really appreciate that. And any kind of input you'd have had would have been incredibly valuable. I'm certain of it, which is why we invited you. But hopefully there'll be lots of other occasions we can collaborate on things. One thing I just wanted to get into briefly, and this is partly my bias as coming from a strength and conditioning background, is the research around whether strengthening specific muscle groups is a way to offset the risk of injury. Or potentially, I guess, looking at it the other way around, like weakness in specific muscle groups might be the reason why a runner gets injured. And you'll have some of your own thoughts on this, I'm sure. But we did a survey a few years ago, which was part of my PhD, and managed to get 2,000 responses as part of this survey. And we had a question in it, which was, if you include resistance training as part of your training regime, like what's the main motivation or what's the reason that you have it in there? And we kind of expected people to say to improve performance because there's a fairly good body of evidence to suggest that is the case.
Yeah.
But the most popular reason with both the competitive, highly trained runners and the more recreational level runners was because they believed it reduces the risk of them getting injured. So they're including resistance training and other similar types of strength training activity in the belief that it reduces the risk of injury. And I guess from a kind of theoretical perspective, that is fairly sound because we know there's quite a lot of research that shows like heavy mechanical loading and things like plyometrics increase bone mineral density, improve tendon resilience and kind of thickness cross-sectional area, improves ligament strength, and improves the length of fascicles, so kind of individual bundles of muscle fibers. So muscles are able to withstand higher forces and loading. So theoretically, if resistance training does those things, then the tissues can cope with a greater volume or intensity of running type loading before they reach this kind of threshold of failure and they get injured. And there's also quite a lot of correlation evidence showing that particularly low hip strength, so low strength in the gluteal muscles in particular, seems to be related to overuse injuries in runners, so like gluteal tendinopathies. There's some research on the IT band and knee pain and Achilles. I think there's one on the Achilles tendon as well. So that would kind of suggest that if we make the hips stronger, particularly the glutes, it should lower the risk of getting those types of injuries. But when we look to sort of the training intervention studies, the evidence is actually quite weak. I partly think this is because the research that's been done in this area has been quite poor so far, not because the research groups are poor or the way in which they've designed the studies is poor, just because studies like this are quite hard to do. So generally the interventions are quite short, they're not supervised, and they're not what I guess me and you would consider sort of proper strength training, like as in going to the gym and lifting quite heavy weights or doing a structured plyometric training routine. It's more kind of home-based type exercises with TheraBands and these sorts of things. And so the actual research to suggest that if a runner does resistance training, it's going to lower their risk of injury is, I guess, sort of quite theoretical at the moment. And there's quite weak research available. But it's not to say there's not going to be better studies, I guess, done in the future.
Yeah, I think this is in the running science realm, I suppose. This is probably, in my opinion, from a performance standpoint, an injury risk standpoint, is the area that needs the most better studies. Does that sound right? Yeah. You touch on most of these things just now, but I do think, the evidence isn't too strong on things like studies that show, well, let me back up. So the concept is you strength train, you change something within the muscle, tendon, or ligaments, or whatever other musculoskeletal tissue that might be important. And the idea is that it might one of the ideas is that it might change the kinematics or how a person moves, right? How the joints move, how the bones and segments move. And the research on this is actually fairly weak as well, where increasing strength doesn't actually change mechanics, or I should say kinematics, how a person moves. So that sort of rejects the idea that stronger tissues or stronger muscles per se, so the hardware, right, the fibers are stronger because of training. It rejects the idea that this would lead to changes in how a person moves. And this is unfortunate, because that would be a simple story, right? You strength train if you have a lot of, let's say, internal hip rotation or hip adduction. So your femurs turn inwards, or your hips sort of collapse inwards. It would be very, very clean and simple to say, if you train your glutes, you will, reduce these, in quotations, excessive motions that might be related to maybe knee injuries and things like that. But it doesn't quite happen this way. And so you mentioned this a little bit, like the neuromuscular aspect of it and other tissues. So that a little hard to tease out, right, in science. How are we changing the central nervous system, and how the central nervous system communicates with muscles, and how it coordinates movement and all this. We can do it, of course, kind of, but not in a way that we can tease out. Is it really responsible? So I agree with you, and I know this is going to piss off some people, but I agree with you that strength training, in theory, is logic. We should logically think that it should help reduce musculoskeletal tissue injuries because it makes them stronger, right? The argument, and I'll just play devil's advocate, even though I agree with you. The argument is that, are those tissue forces or loads that we're causing in the weight room, are they sufficient to withstand the loads necessary during running? So why would a slow concentric or eccentric, say, heel raise, why would this help prevent Achilles injuries if, when we're running, the Achilles is being placed under stress very quickly, so a very high strain rates. So that the stress is fast, and as a result, the strain is fast as well. So why would slow movements, heavy, which is kind of what we're saying might be the best for tissue adaptation, but how does this relate to? And I think the question might be a little off, because again, it's not necessarily matching the demands per se. It's providing a different stimulus for the tissue that it doesn't get while running. And this I think is where we need to go in the research now. Not so much is it matching the demands, but is it providing a different stimulus? Because potentially injuries don't happen because the loads are too high, but because the loads are different. Right? You train in runners. For runners, you train mostly in a straight line, except for when you're on the oval. But then at times you might go on a trail, or you might do uphill running or downhill running, or you change shoes. And as a result, just ever so slightly different loading on a tissue over a few days or some time might, do something that is not what we want, injury. So I think the argument about demands is fair, but I don't think it doesn't matter that much. It's about loading differently. It provides a different stimulus. That's how I think about it from an injury reduction standpoint. And I really think that the science should go in that direction now. And I think the biggest challenge, even with good science, which we're not quite there yet, but even with good science, again, mentioning social media groups on coaches and things. Just last night, there's a Facebook group in the US. It's called like Cross Country Group Coaches or something like that. And the title of the thing was, I just met with our strength. This is a high school cross country coach. I met with our strength and conditioning coaches to come up with a program for our runners. And the coach said, the strength coach said, I think we should progress to, 4 or 5 sets of 2 to 4 reps of heavy loading. And the cross country coach's response in the thread was, at that moment, I realized I was out. I was leaving this program, which in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, this is exactly why, we need to disseminate information better, because obviously this is what you want, from at least from a performance standpoint, but potentially also from an injury standpoint. Yeah, you have to progress there, but that is exactly what you want, right? Slightly more sets, potentially fewer reps, but heavier load. And that's what kind of where you want to get to from a tissue loading standpoint in runners. And the coaches that responded said, it's an endurance sport. You need endurance.
Not specific.
3 set of 20 reps or whatever, and you don't want to bulk up. The heavy stuff will bulk up, and it's all misinformation. Right? And unfortunately, and I know I've said this a couple of times now, but it's more so of a belief now, a culture and education issue, right? All the good science in the world does not change belief, culture, and education. So if we look at the education standards for coaches in the United States, for example, it's not that high. The standards are fairly low. And what's taught isn't that up to date, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at any endurance coaching certification in the US on the strength and conditioning side, first of all, it's very small. There's a small component that's involved there. But also the information is probably 20 years old.
Yeah.
And so it's tough to convince coaches that they shouldn't do the endurance type strength training. Not that they shouldn't do it, but that shouldn't be the priority. When your governing body that accreditates education is saying the same thing you believe in.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So it's difficult.
Yeah. The other couple of things I wanted to mention actually about strength and conditioning exercises as potentially a way to reduce injury risk in runners is a bit more it comes from a bit more of a practical perspective, because it's almost impossible to kind of research. But there's like 2 of the main things that I would consider when I first sit down with a runner who I've just started to work with, or at the start of a new training year, is ask them what overuse injuries that they've had before. And the reason that that's most important is because we know fairly consistently across the literature that the main risk factor for getting an injury is the previous injuries that you've had. And usually when I sit down with a runner and start discussing their previous injuries, you either find out that their rehabilitation has been kind of incomplete or not been great from past injuries, or that they don't do any specific loading on the sites that have been injured in the past. So it would always be one of my priorities with runners that I'm working with, that they're addressing their individual weaknesses in terms of the sites that they've had injuries around before. So if they've had a succession of Achilles injuries over the years, like there'll be a lot of Achilles loading in that particular runner's program. And likewise, if they're always getting hamstring problems, there's a bias towards hamstring conditioning pretty much all year round in that runner's individual program. And the second thing that I think is worth mentioning, particularly with more elite runners, is I guess just looking at, with the coach, like what they're going to be doing across the training year in terms of their key competitions, training camps that they're going to go on, and the types of running terrain that they're going to be faced with at different times of year. And the reason that I found that that's really important is because if a runner suddenly goes to an altitude training camp where they're running up and down hills and the ground's quite rutted, like the kind of extra loading that they're putting on structures around their ankle is quite high compared to the sorts of terrains that they're running on back at home in the UK. And equally, if they're doing a lot of work in spikes because they're preparing for an indoor season, then the phase of training that I'm planning before they go into spikes needs to be heavily geared around, again, probably Achilles, probably hamstring quite a lot, because of the sorts of demands that they're going to be placing on their body like in a month or 2 down the line. So I think it's really important with strength and conditioning to make sure that you are individualizing both around previous injuries and what the runner's got coming up in terms of changes in the sort of environment that they're going to be running in.
Yeah, Rich, I'm totally with you. I love all that you said there. I think one of the big issues with the individualization is often coaches may be a little too late in implementing the prep phase for a change. So you mentioned athletes are going to go, and this is true, totally true. You get athletes go to training camps at altitude, and they, like, for example, here in the U.S., Flagstaff, Arizona is a big one, Mammoth Lakes, Salt Lake City, Boulder. And they have a lot of places to run on trails, roads at times, but it could be rooty or rocky, and often athletes aren't used to that. And a coach might say, okay, you're going to camp. While you're at camp, you also do this strength training exercises to maybe get your body ready to handle those. I'm like, well, it's too late now, right?
Yeah.
You almost, and so that's, I think, an important point to make, is that what you mentioned about is a preparatory phase, if you will, to handle what's coming up. And I think that's where coaches often don't have a solid handle on, is we're going to change things to more spikes. Let's do more loading now, so that in 2 months.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's such an important concept that many coaches don't really sort of pay too much attention to, because again, it is for most coaches, strength training is a support training, right? It's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course not, but if it's done well and a lot of time is spent thinking about this, I think it will definitely change things. And one of the things that we'll notice also is you'll get a lot of coaches who will do strength training in the summertime, especially with high school kids or college kids, and then they stop. When they start to race in August in cross country, which is just early season, they're going until late October, early November, or even later in college, university, I should say. And if you stop training in August, strength training in August, and you're going to spend more time in spikes, in October, November, and the demands, the intensity goes up, right? It's almost like you're missing the point of the value here, is to continue and changing things as you go along. So the timing of it is important, I think. And then also periodization in strength training is something that hasn't really made it in the coaching side of things. Of course, the condition coaches have always been on board with this, and it's very logical. The same way running training periodization is logical for running training, but the marriage of the two hasn't really happened that well yet. So I'm referring more to sort of high school, university type coaching programs here. But anyway, I love what you said there, Rich. I think it's something that knowing injury risks or injury history, adapting your program to fit the needs of that athlete, because we know that, as you said, injury history is the number one predictor of injuries, and that's the only one, frankly.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes total sense to go after that. Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, 100%. So, I think maybe the best way to phrase it, like you said, kind of, it's about preparing the athlete. Like you're kind of using strength and conditioning as it's like you're training to train.
Right.
So you're kind of preparing the body to do better and higher quality running training for whatever the change in environment's going to be in like 2-3 months down the line or whatever. Yeah. And you kind of touched on it before as well, that like obviously in the off season, runners are going to be doing a lot of long, slow distance, like fairly low intensity type work, which has actually got quite a different style, like biomechanical style from the higher sprint speed stuff that's going to come further down the line. So if you kind of just do a sort of general strength and conditioning program, and then all of a sudden the runner gets into spikes and they're sprinting, you've not necessarily prepared them for that kind of change,
right? Which
for a middle distance runner is absolutely key, and maybe a little bit less important for a marathon runner perhaps. And so again, it comes down to the individualization of that athlete's program.
But even then now, like, because the performances have been so not outrageous, I shouldn't say that, but so incredible these days. Even a marathoner who's running, 4:35 per mile, I mean, that's still quite intense. I know it's relative, but still, if you're spending a lot of time just working at, 5:30 to 6 minute or 6:30 per mile pace, and then you transition to more intensity, it's still a large change in demands on the musculoskeletal tissues for sure.
Yeah. So I guess just to finish off, Max, based on what we've discussed so far, what would be your main, I guess, 2 or 3 recommendations to any runners really, but particularly elite runners, to try and avoid overuse type injuries?
Gosh, Rich, that's tough. That's a really tough one. So the main thing I think is, and this might sound like a broken record, but I think ultimately is you're trying to avoid, to me, it's like you're trying to avoid being a hero in training. It's just about sort of uninterrupted, non-heroic training, I suppose, or non-sexy training, but uninterrupted, right? If you do that long enough, very likely you will improve, and probably you will reduce your risk of injuries. And I have to use these sort of non-certain words just because it's just the reality of it, right? But the other thing is is, and I've said this before, it's to steal from one of Kenny Rogers' song. And in the song, he says, "You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them." And that to me goes back to our convo earlier, Rich. It's like at times you want to drop the pairs, or in the analogy, the hard interval at the end, but maybe you hold it close to the chest and just wait, and then be patient. So those would be my two things. It's just avoiding heroic training and not avoiding. You have to do it sometimes, right? But at least not focusing on heroic training, and then knowing when to really back off or hold them.
Yeah. No, I think that's great, and it certainly reflects a lot of what we've spoken about so far. I think for me as well, sort of a big area that we haven't spoken too much about is just like high quality recovery, or ensuring that you are recovering between sessions. So I guess we kind of touched on it a little bit when we're talking about additional lifestyle stresses that are a bit more difficult to quantify, because we always focused on how many miles you've run, like what your pace is on interval training sessions and so on. When I was part of the Great Britain rowing setup, which has obviously been really successful over the last 20 to 30 years, they had this phrase which was world-class training, world-class recovery. And the coaches were always kind of like, okay, we see you guys for maybe 4 hours a day, and you've got the best boats in the world, you've got the best training facilities, you've got the best coaches, you've got the best lake to row on, we take you to the best training camp environments to train in. But they were like, for the other 20 hours of the day, you're kind of on your own, and we don't know what you're doing. And so you need to make sure that you've got equally world-class recovery as well as all the world-class stuff that you're doing in training. So that includes making sure that you're getting adequate rest between sessions, that you're sleeping enough and the sleep's of good quality, that you're refueling in terms of taking on board the right number of calories and carbohydrates. You're repairing, so you're getting enough protein, and the proteins of high enough quality, and you're rehydrating after every single training session. And they kind of had those 4 R's, so rest, refuel, repair, and rehydrate, just to make sure that the recovery was world class. And so any kind of damaged tissues that the athletes were getting from training were repairing and recovering quickly enough before the next training session. Yeah. So I think that those things are equally as important.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's something that it varies so much what that is, right? World-class recovery. At the same time, and again, I agree with you, but I will play devil's advocate here. World-class athletes still get hurt quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so they have the perfect setups, the perfect situations. They don't have to work. Well, some of them don't have to work full time. And so they just get to rest, but they still get injured. So yes, the recovery is so critical, but despite this, they still get injured, right? So it just highlights the importance of training load and how much training dictates injury, because even with all this fancy and world-class recovery, the injuries are still there. And again, no one is saying that recovery, if you recover like a world-class athlete, you will never get injured. Of course, that's not realistic, but to me, it highlights the fact that training load and how what the athlete is experiencing in training plays a major role in injury development.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so we've got managing workload, the relationship you've got with your coach and the rest of your multidisciplinary team, and then ensuring high quality recovery. The other one we've obviously spoken about is strength training. And yeah, I guess I've got a bit of a bias there, but the point I wanted to emphasize around that was just the importance of individualizing strength training. Which seems from my anecdotal perspective to make a difference, particularly over long periods of time, as we've discussed. And I guess I'll mention if viewers want any more details about effective and appropriate strength training for runners, we did a podcast previously with one of the Great Britain international distance runners called Tom Evans. So I think that's a few podcasts back in this series. So just to finish off, Max, you're obviously doing a lot of interesting research-based stuff at the moment, and I think some stuff with runners. What sort of projects have you got going on that listeners might be interested in?
Yeah, we've got several projects on the docket here. Two of my students just finished off their theses, and one was on footwear, bending stiffness in older runners, and the other is on surfaces and strike patterns and speed in young healthy runners. And then the big projects that are starting up next week is on strength training middle-aged runners. So we're having 3 groups of 45 to 60-year-old distance runners, and we're having a heavy resistance training plus plyos, and then endurance training plus plyos. Those are our 3 interventions. And it's only a 10-week study, which is potentially a little not ideal in terms of length, but as you know, the difficulties of running controlled studies for more than that is very, very challenging. So that'll be very interesting. We're primarily focusing on Achilles tendon stiffness, so it's a really plantar flexor focused program, and then also economy and a few sort of ankle function biomechanical variables like kinetics and whatnot. And then a few nice studies from students on footwear and interaction with footwear and foot strikes, the super shoe type concept with how it interacts with foot strike potentially. A couple of nice studies on body weight unloading, some of these instruments that have come out more recently, less expensive than say an Alter G or a Boost treadmill, those kind of things. And so, yeah, I unfortunately and fortunately have a sabbatical this fall.
Oh, nice.
So, I say unfortunately because there's so many good projects that we have on deck, but it'll be a nice time to just sort of, it's a sabbatical, but it's really just catching up, right? And not having to do university meetings and things. But so hopefully we'll get all the things that have been backed up the last few years. We have a couple of nice survey-based studies on coaches' beliefs on injury risks, which includes some questions on strength training and mechanisms. So why do you think that? Not just what do you think? Do you think strength training is good, but why? Those types of questions. And I think we had about, I want to say close to 400 respondents, which isn't that high, but very specific.
That's pretty decent.
Running coaches, not runners necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what's going on. What about yourself?
Yeah, I've got a couple of PhD students that are working on endurance running related projects. I guess the most exciting one at the moment that we've got some data collection going on is around low energy availability and the consequences of low energy intake with female distance runners. So yeah, it's related to what a lot of listeners I guess would have heard of in terms of the relative energy deficiency in sports syndrome, which has kind of I guess superseded a little bit the female athlete triad to some extent. And so we know that long periods of low energy availability with females in particular are quite harmful to the bones. So we get a reduction in bone mineral density, and it obviously increases the risk of bone stress related injuries quite dramatically. Quite conversely, we also know that high impact jumping exercise, so plyometric training, is very good for the bones. But what we don't know is what the interaction is between those two. So if you have a female endurance distance runner who has low energy availability, but they're still doing some sort of high impact plyometric training, whether it kind of gets offset or the risk of bone deterioration gets offset. So we've got a couple of studies going on in that area. And the other one's less related to injury, but just trying to unpick a little bit more some of the neurophysiology that relates to running economy. And I think we will end up doing some sort of intervention with endurance runners, but we're in the early stages of just looking at how running economy changes in a number of different contexts at the minute.
That sounds really exciting and valuable work as well. Yeah, that's really neat. All
right, thanks very much for coming on the podcast anyway, Max, and massively appreciate your expertise and wisdom around these areas.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for inviting me. I hope this was valuable to the listeners.
Thanks for listening to the Loughborough Sportcast. If you want to get in touch and let us know any subject areas or experts that you'd be keen to listen to, then contact me, Martin Foster, on m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk or tweet me at martinfoster82. Bye for now. We'll see you next time.